You think you know someone until you realize you never really did. Viewer discretion advised. Some images and videos used in the documentary are for illustrative purpose only and do not depict the actual event or individual involved. That sentence is thrown around casually when friendships crumble or secrets come to light. But for Kelly Brennan, it was more than words. It was a chilling truth that would define the last months of her life. Kelly Brennan wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was born and raised in a close-knit Staten Island neighborhood. She was the kind of person who left an impression everywhere she went. Friends say Kelly could walk into the most tense, chaotic room and instantly shift the mood. She had a gift, an ability to make people feel important, loved, and safe. With her bright smile and quick wit, she was a force of warmth in a world that could be cold and indifferent. Why don't you want to subscribe to the channel? Tell us your reasons in the comments. She pursued a career in physical therapy, a profession that fit her perfectly. Healing, nurturing, connecting. This wasn't just a job for Kelly. It was who she was. Her patients trusted her. Her friends adored her. And to anyone watching from the outside, she seemed to have life figured out. But sometimes, the brightest lights attract the darkest shadows. When Kelly met Thomas Tulin IV, he appeared to be everything a young woman could want. He was intelligent, sophisticated, charming, a wealthy financial analyst from a privileged Ivy League background. Their relationship began long distance, and at first it felt like a fairy tale, the kind of romance that makes friends gush and strangers believe in fate. Tulin made grand gestures, spoke with eloquence, and showered Kelly with the kind of attention that sweeps you off your feet. But perfection can be deceiving. What Kelly and those around her didn't know was that beneath Tulin's polished exterior lived a much darker reality. Control masked as passion, possessiveness cloaked and declarations of love. It wasn't obvious at first. It rarely is. The early months were intoxicating, but soon subtle cracks began to form. Kelly canceled plans more often. Her bubbly laughter dimmed, and she sometimes appeared emotionally drained after conversations with him. Friends noticed. They asked questions, but Kelly, ever loyal and forgiving, brushed off their concerns. She believed he just loved deeply. She believed intensity meant devotion. But love and obsession are not the same thing. When Kelly tried to pull away, things escalated. Tulin couldn't accept the end of their relationship. The calls, the emails, the unexpected appearances, it all intensified. Kelly's life, once filled with light and laughter, was slowly being consumed by fear and confusion. She wanted freedom, but struggled to find it. The man she thought she knew, the one who had promised love and safety, was becoming someone she didn't recognize at all. And that's where this story begins. Not with a random act of violence, but with a connection that transformed into something dangerous. This is not just a crime story. It's a story about obsession. About how emotional manipulation can quietly strip away safety long before violence ever makes the headlines. It's a story about ignoring red flags because we desperately want to believe people can be better than their darkest impulses. And it's a story that forces us to ask hard questions. Would you recognize danger if it smiled at you? Would you speak up if your friend was in a relationship that made your gut twist, even if they insisted it was nothing? Kelly's journey is a cautionary tale for anyone who has ever second-guessed their instincts, stayed silent when something felt wrong, or believed that love could fix what fear had already broken. Tonight, we're not just recounting events. We're walking through a timeline of charm, control, and catastrophic consequences. We'll peel back the layers of this relationship, how it started, how it spiraled, and how it ended in a moment of unimaginable violence. This is The Untold Trace, and I am your host. Before we continue, I encourage you to pause and think about those questions. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your story or your words might give someone else the courage to act before it's too late. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind a love story that was never really love at all. Because sometimes the most dangerous people are not strangers in the dark alleyways of our cities. They are the ones who promise us safety while quietly plotting to take everything away.
Long before the headlines, long before the tragedy that would forever attach her name to courtroom transcripts and true crime reports, Kelly Brennan lived a life that radiated warmth and ambition. To truly understand the depth of this story and why her loss still resonates, we need to step back and see Kelly as she was before obsession and fear ever clouded her horizon. Kelly was born into a loving family in Staten Island, New York. From the very beginning, she stood out not because she sought attention, but because attention naturally gravitated toward her. Family friends remember her as a child who could light up a room with her laughter, a little girl who carried kindness in her every step. At family gatherings, she wasn't the loudest or most demanding of the kids. Instead, she was the one making sure everyone felt included, bridging gaps between cousins and calming disputes over who got the last piece of cake. Her parents instilled in her a strong sense of empathy and resilience. Her mother described her as the kind of daughter who could read a room without a word being spoken. That emotional intelligence stayed with Kelly, shaping her into someone people instinctively trusted. As she grew older, her circle of friends widened, but the bonds she made were never shallow. If Kelly called you a friend, it meant you had someone who would stand by you through anything. Academically, Kelly thrived. She wasn't just book smart. She had an instinctive ability to understand people, to connect on a level that made her an exceptional listener and problem solver. These traits guided her into physical therapy, a field where science and compassion meet. Helping people heal, rebuild strength, and find confidence again wasn't just a career choice for Kelly, it was a calling. After earning her degree, she made the bold move to Massachusetts to launch her career. It wasn't an easy decision to leave the familiarity of Staten Island, but Kelly was fearless when it came to chasing her goals. In Massachusetts, she quickly established herself as a respected physical therapist. Her clients adored her, not just because she helped them recover physically, but because she made them feel heard. To many, she wasn't just a therapist, she was a confidant, and often a friend. Socially, Kelly was the kind of person who could walk into a new town and leave with lifelong friends. She hosted small get-togethers, joined community events, and had a natural gift for building connections. Her charisma wasn't showy, it was genuine, rooted in a true desire to understand people. Friends described her as the glue that held groups together, someone who could take the most fragmented of circles and turn them into something whole. But even as Kelly thrived professionally and socially, her personal life carried its own complexities. Like many young professionals, she navigated relationships, some fleeting, others more serious. Through it all, she maintained her optimism about love. She believed in partnership, in building a future with someone who valued honesty and mutual respect. That belief would eventually lead her to cross paths with Thomas Toulon IV. Toulon was everything society labels as a catch: Ivy League educated, financially successful, and well-spoken. Born into privilege, He carried himself with confidence that bordered on entitlement. When he and Kelly were introduced through mutual friends during a visit to New York, their chemistry was immediate. Conversations flowed easily, laughter came naturally, and in the early stages, it seemed like the kind of romance people dream about. Despite the challenge of long distance, Kelly invested in the relationship. She traveled to see Toulon when possible, and he returned the effort. They dined at upscale restaurants, strolled through Manhattan streets, and shared moments that felt cinematic. For Kelly, who had always been cautious but hopeful in matters of the heart, Toulon appeared to be someone she could truly envision a future with. Friends recall how excited she seemed at first. She'd talk about his intelligence, his charm, the way he made her feel important. But over time, subtle changes began to appear. She canceled outings more frequently, claiming she was just tired or too busy. Her once lively demeanor occasionally gave way to quiet distraction, as though something was weighing on her that she couldn't quite put into words. Some of her closest friends gently expressed concern. Was everything okay with Toulon? Kelly brushed it off with a smile, insisting that it was just the strain of long distance and their busy careers. And perhaps, in her heart, she wanted to believe that too. But the reality was more complicated. Toulon's affection was intense, bordering on consuming. While Kelly tried to maintain her independence, Toulon seemed to want more of her time, more of her energy, more of her life than she was able or willing to give. This intensity didn't immediately manifest as danger. Instead, it hid beneath layers of charm and grand gestures. Toulon's wealth allowed for spontaneous trips, extravagant gifts, and promises of a shared future that seemed alluring on the surface. For a while, Kelly convinced herself that this was simply passionate love, that his desire to be so deeply involved in her life was a sign of devotion. But as her friends would later recall, something about the relationship felt off. By the time Kelly started recognizing these cracks herself, it was already difficult to walk away. Emotions were entangled, promises had been made, and there was a part of Kelly, the eternal optimist, that believed she could navigate through the difficulties, that things could return to the way they were at the beginning. What Kelly couldn't have known was that this relationship, already shifting from healthy to suffocating, would become the catalyst for a nightmare she couldn't escape.
By the time Kelly Brennan began considering a clean break from Thomas Toulon IV, the relationship had already shifted into something few could truly understand unless they had lived it themselves. What had started as flattering attention, the late-night calls, the carefully crafted emails, the spontaneous romantic gestures, slowly morphed into something far more suffocating. Kelly's friends saw glimpses of it, flashes of unease that Kelly tried to hide behind a brave smile. But when she finally decided to end it, she discovered just how deep Toulon's need for control really went. For Kelly, ending the relationship was supposed to be a moment of relief, a chance to reclaim her independence, her laughter, her life. She had hoped Toulon would understand, even if it stung. But to Thomas Toulon IV, the idea of losing Kelly wasn't just painful, it was unthinkable. After Kelly told him it was over, the phone calls didn't stop. The voicemails came one after another, some filled with apologies, others brimming with anger and accusations. The emails grew longer, more desperate, shifting from love letters to demands for explanations. Even when Kelly didn't respond, Toulon found ways to make his presence known. He showed up unannounced during visits to New York. He appeared at social gatherings, standing across the room, watching but not speaking. Kelly's friends began to notice how unsettled she seemed, how quickly her mood would change if someone mentioned his name. Emotional volatility. Toulon's behavior was unpredictable. At times, he would call Kelly in tears, claiming he couldn't live without her, begging her to reconsider.
Hours later, those same calls would turn venomous, accusations of betrayal, of leading him on, of humiliating him. Friends who overheard snippets of these conversations described Tulin's tone as unhinged, a volatile mix of love and rage. He oscillated between promises of change and thinly veiled threats, always pushing Kelly to stay engaged, to keep responding, to give him hope that their relationship wasn't truly over. Kelly tried to move on. She reconnected with old friends, spent more time focusing on her work, and even rekindled a previous relationship briefly in an effort to find stability. But Tulin wasn't ready to let her slip away. In late 2004, Kelly attended a neighborhood-themed game night that mimicked the popular TV show Wife Swap. It was meant to be harmless fun, friends and neighbors pairing off with different partners for light-hearted games and laughter. Tulin wasn't invited. When he heard about it through mutual acquaintances, his reaction wasn't just jealousy, it was fury. To him, this wasn't just a sign that Kelly had moved on, it was an act of public humiliation. Tulin began expressing rage in his emails and calls, fixating on the event, insisting that Kelly had disrespected him. This wasn't love anymore. This was entitlement, ego, and unchecked anger. After the game night, Tulin's behavior escalated further. Despite living states away, he found ways to keep tabs on Kelly. He monitored her social media activity obsessively, tracked her movements through mutual friends, and showed an uncanny awareness of where she went and who she spent time with. Kelly confided in some friends that she felt watched, but downplayed the seriousness of it. She said, "He's just not taking the breakup well. He'll get over it." But he wasn't getting over it. He was getting worse. Tulin's emails became more invasive, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. Calls came at all hours of the night. When Kelly blocked one number, another would appear. The psychological weight of his persistence wore her down, making every day feel like a battle between trying to move forward and bracing for the next intrusion. The false calm. By early 2005, there were moments where it seemed like Tulin had finally backed off. The calls slowed, the emails came less frequently. Friends hoped the nightmare was ending. Kelly began smiling again, focusing on her career, and even rekindled a previous relationship briefly in an effort to find stability. But Tulin wasn't ready to let her slip away. What Kelly didn't know was that during this lull, Tulin's obsession hadn't faded, it had deepened. Instead of moving on, he was watching, waiting, and planning. Friends later recalled that while he stopped making noise publicly, he seemed to grow more fixated privately. His anger didn't dissipate, it simmered. In the weeks leading up to February 2005, small red flags appeared that hinted at something darker brewing underneath the surface. Tulin sent cryptic messages hinting at unfinished business between them. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing him in places where Kelly had been recently, even though he had no reason to be there. Kelly's intuition began nagging her more strongly than before. She mentioned to a close friend that something about Tulin's silence felt off, but she couldn't quite explain why. Despite these instincts, Kelly never imagined how far he would go. After all, he was still living states away, busy with his own career and life. Or so she thought. What Kelly didn't know was that Tulin had crossed a threshold in his mind. The breakup wasn't just rejection anymore. It was a challenge to his control, an attack on his ego that demanded a response. And in his world, there was only one way to reclaim that control. The story was no longer just about heartbreak or obsession. It was on the brink of becoming something far more dangerous. And in February 2005, that danger would finally take physical form.
Why haven't you subscribed already? Tell us why you don't want to subscribe in the comments. On February 9th, 2005, Kelly Brennan boarded a ferry to Nantucket. It wasn't meant to be a life-changing trip. She had a work-related appointment there, the kind of short, routine visit that physical therapists often made to assist clients in remote locations. The winter air was cold but calm. The island, off-season, was quieter than usual. Kelly had been here before and planned to return home without much thought. Friends recalled that she sounded optimistic that week, mentioning plans for dinner and weekend outings when she got back. It was supposed to be a normal day, but someone else had different plans. Unbeknownst to Kelly, Thomas Tulin IV had already arrived in Nantucket. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a last-minute vacation or a business trip. Investigators would later piece together Tulin's movements. He had booked a last-minute flight and ferry ride, ensuring he reached the island ahead of Kelly. There were no meetings scheduled, no friends waiting to see him. He had traveled to Nantucket for one reason: Kelly Brennan. Witnesses reported seeing the man matching his description at the ferry terminal, keeping to himself but seemingly watching every arrival. There were sightings near the airport later that day. Tulin was not hiding, but he wasn't openly drawing attention either. For Tulin, this wasn't an impulsive act. It was deliberate. Details of what happened next are drawn from forensic evidence, witness statements, and Tulin's own inconsistent accounts. What's clear is that at some point during that day, Tulin and Kelly crossed paths near her rental car outside the Nantucket airport. The confrontation was sudden and brutal. Kelly, unarmed and unaware of the danger she was walking into, was attacked with a knife. She sustained multiple stab wounds, each one more frenzied than the last. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she fought desperately to protect herself. But she was overpowered. It was not a quick or impersonal act. It was fueled by rage and obsession, a violent culmination of months of stalking and emotional manipulation. Details of what happened next are drawn from forensic evidence, witness statements, and Tulin's own inconsistent accounts. What's clear is that at some point during that day, Tulin and Kelly crossed paths near her rental car outside the Nantucket airport. The confrontation was sudden and brutal. Kelly, unarmed and unaware of the danger she was walking into, was attacked with a knife. She sustained multiple stab wounds, each one more frenzied than the last. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she fought desperately to protect herself, but she was overpowered. It was not a quick or impersonal act. It was fueled by rage and obsession, a violent culmination of months of stalking and emotional manipulation. Police began their investigation methodically. They spoke to Kelly's acquaintances, her coworkers, her close friends. One name surfaced again and again: Thomas Tulin IV. Witnesses recalled the rocky breakup, Tulin's obsessive behavior, and his angry messages. Surveillance footage confirmed their suspicions. Tulin had traveled to Nantucket that same day. Even more damning was the discovery of blood-stained clothing found discarded in a trash bin near the airport. DNA analysis would later link the blood directly to Kelly. Tulin's own timeline didn't help his case. He claimed he had gaps in his memory, suggesting he didn't fully remember what happened. But investigators were unconvinced. The evidence painted a different story. A last-minute ticket purchased for Nantucket. No other reason for his presence there. Forensic evidence tying him to the scene. This wasn't confusion or coincidence. It was premeditated murder. When police reached out to Tulin, he didn't attempt to flee. He also didn't confess. Instead, he maintained a calm demeanor, telling authorities that he simply couldn't recall the events of that day. To the public, this lack of emotion was chilling. To prosecutors, it suggested calculation rather than remorse. The silence, the selective memory, and the trail of evidence all pointed to a man who had crossed a line long before stepping onto Nantucket's shores. For Kelly's loved ones, learning the details of that day was devastating. The fear she had lived with, the attempts to move on, and the false calm before the storm, it had all been leading to this moment. The man who claimed to love her, who once promised a future together, had stalked her across state lines and ended her life in a fit of rage. Kelly's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a brutal reminder of how dangerous obsessive control can become when warnings are ignored or minimized. The small Nantucket community, largely insulated from high-profile crimes, was shaken. Locals described a palpable sense of unease in the days following the murder. Vigils were held, candles lit in Kelly's memory, and conversations about stalking and emotional abuse surged in ways the community had rarely seen before. This wasn't just a crime story unfolding in headlines. It was a human story of love distorted, red flags missed, and a life stolen too soon. The island, once known for its quiet beauty, became the setting for a nightmare that would soon play out in courtrooms and news broadcasts nationwide. But for Kelly's loved ones, the trial and conviction that followed would do little to ease the ache of losing her. What happened on that February day couldn't be undone. It could only be understood, and that understanding would come during the long, grueling legal battle ahead.
When Kelly Brennan's body was discovered in her rental car outside Nantucket Airport, the shock was immediate and devastating. The island, usually serene and far removed from high-profile crime, became the center of a murder investigation that would reveal a chilling portrait of obsession, control, and premeditated violence. From the very first hours, investigators knew this was no random act. There was no theft, no forced entry. This was personal. Every piece of evidence whispered one name: Thomas Tulin IV. Detectives started by interviewing Kelly's closest friends and colleagues. The name Thomas surfaced repeatedly. Friends recounted months of stalking behavior, the unrelenting calls, the volatile mood swings. Kelly had confided about her attempts to break free. The way Tulin refused to accept their relationship was over. Surveillance footage sealed their suspicions. Cameras at Logan Airport and Nantucket Ferry captured Tulin's journey that day, each step bringing him closer to Kelly. Witnesses recalled seeing him near the airport, pacing, waiting. When police canvassed nearby areas, they discovered a trash bin containing blood-stained clothes. DNA analysis later confirmed what detectives already feared. The blood belonged to Kelly Brennan. The pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. Tulin had tracked Kelly down, cornered her on the island, and carried out a brutal attack driven by rage and control. Despite the mounting evidence, Thomas Tulin IV did not flee. When police contacted him, he met them with a calm, collected demeanor that many found unsettling. There were no tears, no visible signs of remorse. In interviews, Tulin claimed he could not fully remember the events of that day. It was as if his mind had blacked out, leaving him with fragmented memories and unanswered questions. But prosecutors saw this as calculated evasion, an attempt to avoid responsibility for a deliberate act of murder. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, transported back to Massachusetts to await trial. For Kelly's family and friends, the arrest brought a flicker of relief, but it could not erase the pain of losing her in such a violent, senseless way. The prosecution meticulously pieced together Tulin's actions leading up to the murder. They highlighted the sudden booking of flights and ferry rides to Nantucket, the stalking behavior documented through emails, calls, and testimonies,
The discovery of the bloody clothes and matching DNA evidence. Witness sightings placing him near the crime scene on the day of the killing. Prosecutors painted a clear picture. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was premeditation. Tulin had the means, motive, and opportunity. He had crossed state lines to find Kelly, confronted her, and carried out the brutal attack when she resisted his attempts to reconcile. Tulin's defense team faced an uphill battle. With overwhelming forensic and circumstantial evidence, they chose to argue diminished responsibility. They claimed Tulin suffered from severe mental illness, leading to impaired judgment and memory lapses. They suggested his actions were not those of a calculating murderer, but of a man overcome by psychological turmoil. This defense introduced psychiatric experts, detailing Tulin's struggles with substance abuse and emotional instability. They attempted to humanize him, portraying a man spiraling out of control rather than someone who had planned a killing. But for Kelly's loved ones, this argument felt like an insult, a way to deflect blame rather than confront the reality of his actions. In 2007, the courtroom became a battleground for truth and justice. Family members sat stoically as prosecutors unveiled the grim details of Kelly's final hours. Friends took the stand, recounting months of warning signs, Tulin's possessiveness, his refusal to accept the breakup, his increasingly erratic behavior. Jurors saw the timeline laid out. The toxic relationship that drained Kelly's spirit, the obsessive pursuit that escalated after she tried to leave, the planned trip to Nantucket, the brutal confrontation that ended her life. Emails, voicemails, and surveillance footage hammered home the narrative of premeditation. Experts testified about stalking behavior, noting how patterns of control often culminate in lethal violence when victims attempt to leave. When Tulin's defense presented their psychiatric argument, it failed to sway the jury. The notion that his actions were purely the result of mental illness didn't align with the calculated steps he took, buying tickets, traveling discreetly, disposing of evidence. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Tulin showed little visible reaction as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Kelly's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but no sentence could bring her back or erase the horror of what she endured. Tulin's legal battle didn't end there. In 2011, he successfully appealed the conviction, arguing that flawed jury instructions and potential media bias had compromised the fairness of his trial. A retrial was granted, reopening old wounds for Kelly's family and forcing them to relive the tragedy. Despite this second chance for Tulin, the evidence remained undeniable. The retrial concluded with the same verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Justice, once again, had caught up with him. Kelly Brennan's story became more than just a case file. Advocacy groups cited her murder as a stark example of the dangers of stalking and emotional abuse. Public awareness campaigns emphasized the importance of recognizing red flags early: possessiveness, obsessive monitoring, refusal to accept boundaries as potential precursors to lethal violence. Experts in domestic violence prevention highlighted Kelly's case in seminars and workshops, teaching communities how to support victims trying to leave toxic relationships. Laws around stalking and protective orders gained renewed attention, aiming to prevent tragedies like Kelly's from repeating. Through it all, Kelly's loved ones remained steadfast in honoring her memory. They spoke publicly about her kindness, her laughter, and her dedication to helping others. Her family pushed for increased resources for stalking victims, hoping that by sharing her story, they could save other families from the same pain. Kelly's legacy is not of fear, but of courage, a reminder that controlling behavior should never be mistaken for love, that red flags should not be ignored, and that speaking up can save lives. Even as Thomas Tulin IV spends the rest of his life behind bars, the echoes of Kelly's story endure, not just in court records or documentaries, but in the quiet moments where someone finally recognizes the signs, takes a step back, and finds the strength to walk away before obsession turns deadly.
The courtroom verdict may have marked the official end of Thomas Tulin IV's ability to hurt anyone else, but for Kelly Brennan's loved ones, the story didn't end there. The years that followed were filled with grief, advocacy, and a determination to make sure her death would not be remembered solely as a statistic in crime reports. The aftermath of Kelly's murder left ripples far beyond Nantucket or Massachusetts courtrooms. It ignited conversations about stalking, emotional abuse, and the silent dangers that can escalate to tragedy when ignored. When Tulin was led away in handcuffs after his conviction, a wave of emotion washed over the courtroom. Relief, anguish, anger that this trial had ever been necessary. Kelly's family had sat through every minute of gut-wrenching testimony, listening to graphic details of her final moments, all while maintaining an unshakable dignity that inspired everyone watching. For her parents, siblings, and closest friends, there was no celebrating the guilty verdict. Justice, while necessary, could not fill the hole left by Kelly's absence. Family gatherings felt quieter. Her laughter, once the life of every room, was now only a memory. Her patients and co-workers spoke about how her absence left a void in their lives, how the physical therapy clinic where she had been a rising star felt dimmer without her energy. But even in those early days of mourning, there was an understanding among those who loved her. This story could not end here. Kelly's family made a conscious choice to transform their grief into purpose. They began speaking publicly about stalking and the signs of emotionally abusive relationships. At vigils and awareness events, they told Kelly's story, not just the horror of her death, but the fullness of her life, the kindness she carried, in the red flags that friends had noticed long before the tragedy occurred. This wasn't about assigning blame to Kelly or her loved ones. It was about shining a light on patterns that are often dismissed. Partners who demand constant control over who you see and where you go. Relationships where apologies and rage come in dizzying cycles. When your instincts tell you something feels wrong, even if it's not yet physical. Kelly's case became a teaching moment. Domestic violence prevention organizations began citing her story in seminars, workshops, and college lectures. They emphasized that danger doesn't always come with physical bruises. It often begins invisibly, wrapped in words of love that slowly strangle independence and safety. Over the years, advocacy stemming from Kelly's case contributed to broader conversations about strengthening laws against stalking and improving support systems for victims. Protective orders, mental health interventions, and resources for those attempting to leave controlling relationships gained more visibility. Communities began pushing for education programs to help young adults recognize unhealthy relationship dynamics early on. Law enforcement agencies improved training to handle stalking complaints with greater urgency, understanding that what may seem like just persistence could in fact be a precursor to violence. One of the hardest truths Kelly's loved ones shared was this: silence can be deadly. Friends had seen signs of trouble. They noticed Kelly becoming more withdrawn, emotionally exhausted. They felt uneasy about Tulin's possessiveness, but like many bystanders, they hesitated to push too hard, afraid of overstepping or losing her trust. Kelly herself tried to manage it quietly, believing it would eventually fade away. But silence allowed the obsession to fester. In honoring Kelly's memory, her advocates stress that speaking up, whether as the person in the relationship or as a concerned friend, can be life-saving. They remind us that it's better to risk awkward conversations than to stay silent while danger grows unchecked. Years later, friends and family still wrestle with questions. Could we have done more? Should we have intervened differently? What if she had sought a restraining order sooner? While those questions may never have answers, sharing them openly has provided healing for others in similar situations. Survivors of stalking and emotional abuse have reached out to Kelly's family, saying her story gave them the courage to leave their own dangerous relationships. That, they believe, is Kelly's continuing gift to the world, saving lives through her legacy, even in her absence. Despite the darkness that ended her life, Kelly's memory shines brightest when people speak of who she truly was, a woman who dedicated her career to healing others, a loyal friend who could bring laughter in the heaviest moments, a sister and daughter whose compassion bound her family together, a person full of dreams and potential, stolen far too soon. Those who knew her choose to remember her not as a victim defined by tragedy, but as a light that continues to guide others towards safety, strength, and self-worth. Kelly's story teaches lessons we can't afford to ignore. Obsession is not love. True love respects boundaries and independence. Control is not protection. It is a warning of deeper danger. Danger isn't always visible. Emotional manipulation can be just as lethal as physical violence. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Speak up. Whether you're in an unhealthy relationship or watching a friend struggle, silence only allows escalation. By facing these truths, we can begin preventing similar tragedies from happening to others. As this story concludes, we're left with a sobering reality. Kelly Brennan should still be here today. She should be laughing with friends, building her career, dreaming of her future. Instead, her life was cut short by a man who believed control equaled love and who couldn't accept her freedom. But her story doesn't end in that rental car outside Nantucket Airport. It lives on in every conversation sparked by her case, in every survivor who finds strength to walk away, and in every life saved because someone recognized the signs and spoke up. This is The Untold Trace, and I am your host. If Kelly's story has moved you, if it's opened your eyes to the silent dangers many endure, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video with someone who may need the reminder that their instincts matter, that safety matters, and that control is never love. Your story, your voice, could be the difference between someone staying silent and someone finally finding a way out.